All right, today we're going to talk about how to stress test your personal value system with real life scenarios and why your value system needs to be stress tested in order for you to act confidently and with self-esteem based on your own values. Otherwise, you will live a life that is very inauthentic and that feels incongruent with who you are. And you'll wake up dreading your days more and more, feeling like each day, each act in your life is more and more an act of bad faith in yourself. So today, again, we're talking about how to stress test your value system so that you know what those values are. So you separate the wheat from the chaff. So you know, okay, these are pseudo values or fake values, and these are real, authentic values that I want to have. Because you'll know what your values are. You will know what your values are the moment that they cost you something. So until that point, you don't really know what your values are. And what you have aren't really values even at all. What you have actually are converted to values when they're stress tested. But what you currently have, until you stress test those values, until you actually pay for the values that you have, they are merely assumptions and slogans and personal branding statements. They're useful in conversation, and they might even be convincing to yourself, but they haven't been tested, and they actually haven't been paid for. And until they have, then they can't really do what values are supposed to do, which is to impose constraint on your life. They force a choice. They introduce tension. They survive trade-offs. Values survive trade-offs. The failure rarely begins with some dramatic contradiction. It starts with a hesitation. A moment comes when you defer and you soften and you revise your action because the stated value that you had just no longer feels sufficient to justify your action. Right? Nothing breaks. The decision gets made. The story moves on in your life, but the structure doesn't hold. And what you said was a value of yours just didn't apply because you never really paid for it. So it never really was a value that imposed any kind of constraint in your life, which means it wasn't ever really a personal value at all. So eventually, this happens over and over again, and that inconsistency compounds. And you find yourself explaining decisions you can't map to your own commitments. You start to perform these values rather than actually use them. Maybe at one time you were doing them when it felt easy, but you start to perform these values rather than actually rely on them. And what's left is not self-authorship. What's left is just a frictionless moral theater of your current circumstance. So today we're talking about how to interrupt that values drift by forcing your values into conflict conditions and watching what survives. So first, I want to discuss why your stated values actually collapse. So most people, including myself, overestimate the integrity of their values system because it has never been placed under that functional stress. So a value feels very clear until it generates a cost. It feels very coherent to you. Yeah, this makes sense, until it competes with another value. A value feels virtuous until someone else pulls you to that value. Then it doesn't really feel virtuous. Then it feels like an imposition. So take a common example. A person claims to value honesty, right? It's not performative. They really, really believe it. But when their friend makes a mistake, and correcting their friend in that mistake would be socially awkward or emotionally risky, they don't say anything. They justify that omission. They say, it wasn't the right time. It wasn't really my place to say anything. So what happens? What happened there? Right? What occurred wasn't a betrayal of your friend. It wasn't even really a betrayal of yourself. It was just a failed stress test. The value failed to constrain and therefore failed to satisfy the minimum criteria for being a personal value. So, the philosopher John Dewey, we've talked about him before. He has a book called Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. And in his book, Logic, Dewey defines moral reasoning as interaction with uncertainty. So a value is not real when it's declared. It becomes real when it orients action within indeterminate situations. So this is where the stakes are unclear and the trade-offs are real. And in Dewey's frame, the value system doesn't precede the problem. The value system actually emerges through the friction of the conflict situation, of the stress test. And the mistake is treating values as philosophical priors, right? We think of a value system as this idea, this set of ideas in our head. I value this and this and this and this and this. In principle, right? But these are aspirations. This is branding. This is you marketing you to yourself. So again, that mistake is the primary, fundamental, primitive mistake people make in conceiving or thinking about personal values is treating them as philosophical priors. They are closer to hypotheses, which are unstable until tried. So now I want to talk about this concept of pseudo-value, because that's what we really hold. And what we want to do is see which pseudo-values pass the test. And what is that test constituted of? So many values appear functional because they are rewarded at the level of identity. They generate coherence and admiration or social belonging, but not constraint. And these pseudo-values fall into patterns. So there's a couple like buckets we could put pseudo-values in. The first one is ambient pseudo-values or ambient values. Ambient values are adopted from cultural norms and they're left unexamined. Like, I value growth. We value growth here and authenticity and impact, right? These are ambient values. They're just kind of like cultural buzzwords where you're like, no, I definitely, no, but they resonate with some part of you, but they're in particular. So you have ambient values, then you have brand values. Brand values are optimized for signaling alignment to audiences or tribes, right? Yeah, we value this here. So you got ambient values, brand values. You also have redemptive values. These are used to cancel out past decisions or to soften cognitive dissonance, right? So like people who say things like, well, I believe in second chances. It's like, okay, maybe you need to believe that so that you can justify giving yourself a second chance. Maybe not. Maybe it's good to believe in second chances. It's not about what the value is. It's about why you believe it. So you've got these pseudo values, or ambient values, brand values, redemptive values. And these survive until friction appears, right? So I believe in second chances until somebody requires me to give them a second chance. Right. Like at that point, those values either evaporate or they mutate into justifications. Well, I don't know. Right. The test is not whether the values feel noble. You can make anything feel noble. The test is whether those values exclude legitimate alternative in adverse conditions. So William James, one of my favorite philosophers, in his book Pragmatism, he writes that truth is not found in coherence alone, but in what works, what he calls the cash value. So what endures through contact with difficulty. Values operate the same way. If they don't appear in contrast to reality, or if they don't appear in constraint, they were never really governing a decision. So let's dig deeper into that concept of constraint. Constraint as the domain of value catalyzation. Constraint as the place where values are born. Values don't succeed by expressing aspiration. They succeed by removing optionality from your life. So that constraint can take different forms. So first we have a soft constraint. A soft constraint is emotional friction, hesitation or guilt or inner resistance. When I feel these things, right? Do I still enact the value anyway? Right? If my friend makes some kind of error, and it would be an assistance to him to tell him about that, but it would wound his ego, and I'm going to feel bad about making him feel bad. but I believe that I value personal honesty. In that moment, my belief that I value personal honesty and relational straightforwardness and direct communication, that's is not yet a value. It becomes a value when I feel guilty for that I may hurt him, and then I do it anyway because it's a value. So that's the soft constraints. You push through the emotional boundary between you and enacting that value, because there's going to be the emotional resistance there. Then you've got a hard constraint. The hard constraint is the observable behavioral cost, which is time or money or reputational impact, right? This is where your friend makes maybe a public mistake and you stand behind him and you say, no, this is my friend, right? It actually costs you something behaviorally and it hurts. So you've got soft constraint, hard constraint, and then you've got constitutive constraint. A constitutive constraint is a non-negotiable exclusion. So this is like, I don't do that even when it's reasonable. I don't do that even when it's reasonable. These are constitutional constraints. These are values that you never budge on. There's no like situational qualification here. So when a value doesn't produce at least one of these effects in conflict scenarios, then it isn't structuring a choice. It may be held sincerely, but it isn't functionally present. So how do we move then from values as like a branding mechanism, a self-branding mechanism, to values as actually things that structure our behavior? So the modern advice economy, we've discussed this, treats values as aesthetic assets. They're meant to be declared, not necessarily lived. And profiles and content and team pages and manifestos, all this, these are optimized for articulation, not tension. And the appearance of having values becomes more important than the actual application of those values. And this reverses what we would call in Galen Strawson's model of reactive attitudes. So in Strawson's book, Freedom and Resentment, he frames accountability as a feature of human psychology. We praise, we blame, we judge other people and each other as if values are stable across time. But in the branding model, we perform the language of stability without undergoing the cost. The moral gesture itself replaces the moral structure. So we have to mature from a personal value system as moral gesturing to one that is genuine moral structure. And we achieve that maturation by paying in contexts of soft constraint, which is the emotion, hard constraint, which is the behavior, and constitutional constraint, which is unqualified, unhesitating. This is what I do. So, if no one is allowed to demand that a value actually behave, then it becomes exempt from stress and therefore exempt from integration. And in this case, we also have to track failure. So let's return to an example we mentioned earlier, right? A person values honesty, but they sidestep a conversation because it would be uncomfortable. And later, they offer a partial version of the truth, framed to like minimize exposure. And the friendship survives, but the internal contradiction doesn't disappear, right? It simply goes unexamined. And we repeat this enough times and the system adjusts. The value remains stated, but it no longer predicts behavior. And this is the ordinary path by which value systems dissolve, not through this dynamic collapse and deconversion and deconstruction, but through accumulated micro failures that were never fed back into the structure. So how do we move from stated values to operational values? So a value system becomes functional when it meets three conditions. Number one, predictive stability. The value system accurately forecasts future behavior under pressure. So predictive stability. Number two is constraint enforcement. The value system removes available options even when they remain socially or personally defensible. And number three, judgment exposure. It produces dissonance when violated, even in the absence of consequences or witnesses. So you don't need to feel better when acting on a value. Usually it's the opposite. You need to notice when acting against that value stops generating discomfort. That's when the value has left the system. So I want to run through a method for actually introducing these constraint situations, these conflict situations, a method for creating stress tests for your values, which are essentially rites of initiation for yourself to mature into somebody that actually holds the value rather than somebody who merely believes or gestures at having this value, right? So what we're going to look at now is a method for maturing your value system from performative to behavioral to real. This is a method for kind of artificially, but genuinely paying the cost so that the values can be yours. So most people don't realize their value system is broken until it stops making decisions for them, right? They aren't betraying their beliefs. They're discovering that the system they trusted has no internal process for handling cost. A value you believe is not a value you can use. The only way to find out whether a value is real is to put it in contact with something the value itself, that specific value, can't ignore. So consider somebody who spent years, and we're kind of using the same theme of honesty in relationships here because it's kind of generic, but everybody, I think, deals with this to some degree, right? So consider somebody who spent years softening their speech in close relationships. Not because they're trying to be deceptive, but to preserve comfort, right? To avoid judgment, to keep things smooth. And eventually that strategy starts to produce distortion. They feel unseen, unaccounted for, vague. So they adopt a new value, directness. They go, I'm going to be direct now. And they commit to it, not because it's right, but because the alternative has become untenable. The problem is not intention. The problem is structural stress. Can the system accommodate the value before it ejects it? Because what's going to happen is they're going to say, I want to be direct now. I'm going to be direct. And then they walk into the relationship and they're like, okay, never mind. Never mind. Right? Part of adopting a value is having a plan of putting that value through a stress test and saying, okay, I'm going to commit to holding this value in a way that actually constrains my behavior so that I can't go, never mind. No more never mind. So how do you get to that place? It's not that simple, right? It's not as simple as saying, well, this is your value, so do it. You can't just say, be a person of integrity. You can't just do that. I mean, you can. That's a method. That is actually a method. But there are other methods that are a little bit more repeatable and organic and universally adoptable, say. So how do you test a value that you have? Well, there's two methods here. Well, there's two kinds of values actually that need to be tested, that you can kind of artificially or design tests for in your life that create opportunities for you to pay for them so that they become genuine. One is for values that you already have. The second is for new values that you want to have. So again, values fail silently, not through contradiction, but not through like, well, this value conflicts with that value. Oh, no, it's not. But the values fail because of erosion when their governing force is replaced by justification or delay or narrative smoothing. Essentially, values fail and erode and disappear when they are not exercised. Personal values are like a muscle and they will atrophy. So what we are doing here is creating or designing situations or opportunities for those values to remain strong, to become strong, or to collapse and say, this is not part of me. So the first method for testing a value or for paying for a value is to simulate a direct collision. And this is for a value you already have. So simulate a direct collision. So don't ask what the value actually affirms. Ask what the value forbids. So in our example of the person who has been traditionally soft in their language in relationships and is wanting to commit to being more direct. Let's say that this person values kindness, but they withhold difficult truths. Now they imagine telling a friend, you've been speaking to me in a way that makes me feel manipulated. The statement is true and the risk is real. Does the value constrain or does the value collapse? The question is, can you say that? And it doesn't matter how you feel, it doesn't matter how scared you are. But if you can say that, then that value becomes more of a value to you. Number 2, track what doesn't change. So in a live conversation, this person may notice that their tone softens mid-sentence, right? They kind of hedge, right? They jitter on the like on the joystick a little bit, and they ask instead of say, right? So the value is present, but only under reflection, right? It doesn't arrive with the behavior, which means it isn't structuring yet. So you want to simulate a direct collision. You want to track what doesn't change when you try to implement the value and iterate and improve on that. And number 3, you want to find where justification appears too early. So for example, afterwards, they might explain to themselves, I hesitated. I softened my language, even though I'm trying to be more direct because I think it would have made things worse. And now just wasn't the time, right? So the rationale forms faster than the dissonance actually does. And that speed of rationale or justification is the signal. The value hasn't failed, but the system is trying to protect the structure that preceded it. It's trying to prevent shifts. So again, you've got simulating a direct collision, track what doesn't change, find where justification appears too early. Testing doesn't reveal what you believe, it reveals what remains active when belief is no longer assaulted, which is in conflict situations. So that's how to stress test a value you already have. How do you stress test a new value, or how do you acclimate to a new value? So when you adopt a new value, whether that it's by necessity or because of a failure or because of a redefinition of your life, it feels immediately fragile. Not because it's false, but because your system hasn't rehearsed its consequences. And without integration, it will always feel like a performance. So what you do is, number 1, when integrating a new value into your life, you run a zero integrity rehearsal. So what does this mean? It means that the person who has a new value rehearses the sentence that they want to say alone, right? What you said in that group made me feel uncomfortable. So you rehearse that, right? Doesn't feel wrong. It feels foreign. It feels like wearing somebody else's posture, right? Or let's say that you have a value of wanting to approach women more. So you practice a line and you say, okay, I'm going to practice this line. And it's like, that doesn't feel like me. That's not something I typically would say. That's not something I would typically do. It feels like putting on somebody else's behavior. It feels authentic. But what you're doing is you're baby stepping your way into a genuine behavior change, right? What you can't say out loud isn't too harsh or inauthentic or wrong. It's new. Right? So you want to rehearse your behaving these values in the mirror in zero integrity ways. And then you move on to the second method of acclimating to a new value in your life is you create a small moral failure. So continuing with our theme of somebody that wants that is adding a new value of personal honesty into their life. So at dinner, they say nothing when the same dynamic appears, but later they write it down. And then they send a message. I didn't speak up last night. I should have. This is what I needed to say. What you said made me feel uncomfortable. Right? The point isn't correctness. The point is exposure. Now the value has surface tension. Right? So if you have a failure in your value system and you say, "Wow, I said that I value directness and communication, but I completely chickened out. I didn't say anything when I felt uncomfortable." You can still say something. So the first step is rehearse these things in a zero, in a zero stakes way. The second is to is to not miss the opportunity to come back and address moments of moral failure, right? Like, you ever do that where you instinctively cover your ass or lie, and you're like, ooh, it's going to be real humiliating. Like, and you realize it after the fact, and you go, why did I say that? I did that thing when I didn't do it. And you're like, I was just trying to look like a good person. And then you're like, it's going to sting to say, you know what? I just lied. I actually did this the other day. Somebody was like, did you do that thing? And I was like, oh yeah. And then I like walked away and I was like, oh, I did not do that. And I realized I was like, I was just trying to look like a good person. So I was like, I can't believe I just did that. So I had to go back and I had to say, okay, I didn't do that. And it just stung. It was an ego wound, you know? But what I knew was, and I felt the stakes of that moment, because if I had let that go, and if I had said, you know what, nobody's going to know, nobody's checking up on me, right? Like, I'm not getting graded on this life. Like, this is not, I'm not going to get an A- now because of an A. Like all this will do is cost me some reputational integrity, or cost me reputational points in this person's eyes. This is only going to cost me. But that perspective is actually false. What would cost much more is for me to have lied and said nothing and fixed nothing. That would have cost me my personal value of honesty. I would have become, in that moment, a less honest person. So what actually happened was, because I lied, I have an identity of saying I don't lie. I tell people this. I tell myself this. I don't lie, but I did in that moment. And I came back around, and it stung. Oh my God, to admit, like, dude, I don't know why I lied, but I did lie, and I didn't do the thing that you asked me if I did. That made me a more honest person than I was before I lied. You understand? That actually reinforced the value even more. So methods. So these are methods for integrating values into our lives, right? We run a zero integrity rehearsal. We create some small moral failure. 3, we design a reversible collision. So let's say a few days after the fact, when a person values honesty, right? And they don't say something. So or let's say they say it in person, right? What you said made me uncomfortable. They say it plainly, they say it without framing. The reaction is mixed. A little distance follows, but nothing breaks. This is what medium stakes testing feels like, where the value tightens its grip and the identity doesn't fracture. And then the 4th method is we wait for it to surface uninvited. So let's say weeks later, a similar moment arrives and the sentence appears before the fear does. You say, hey, like, don't talk to me like that. No deliberation, just execution. You know, I'm not going to defer here. I'm not going to defer here. And all of a sudden you've got a little confidence there, right? But it's actually not confidence. It's the constraint of the value playing out in your life. The value has been internalized. Okay, this is the method of integrating and acclimating to a new value in your life. Is you slowly increase the stakes of the conflict situation within which you stress test a value to more deeply and deeply internalize it, so it becomes more and more a subconscious behavior. This is not a ritual. It's a reformatting of your constraint logic. Most people abandon new values not because they are wrong, but because they arrive too fast. And when a value hasn't been metabolized, it produces psychological dissonance, and that dissonance gets misread as inauthenticity. So the value is discarded because you're like, I tried to be this kind of person, but I don't think I'm that kind of person. When in reality, you just didn't acclimate to that value. So here's what stress testing reveals. A value system functions only if it governs behavior. When the incentive structure breaks down, if a value does not introduce conflict when chosen, and it isn't a value, it's an idea without any kind of architecture. So real values survive what they disrupt. They regulate decisions when coherence would be easier than commitment. They absorb loss. What you believe does not reveal what you hold. What you can enact under cost does. A value system is not a map of what matters. A value system is the architecture that decides what to do when those things collide A value system is a collection of behavioral patterns that you have paid for. And the way to establish and cultivate a personal value system that you have a conscious connection to, that is subconscious, that feels like confidence. The way to cultivate a personal value system that feels like confidence is to pay for each value by creating conflict situations within which to stress test those values so that you can pay for them with constraint, with the soft constraint of emotional discomfort, with the hard constraint of behavioral or reputational cost, or with the constitutional constraint saying, I do this without qualification. Okay? Again, the way of building your personal value system is to pay for it one value at a time with cost.